Good morning, everyone. My name is David Blatt, and I'm proud to be Executive Director of Oklahoma Policy Institute. So appreciative of the staff who is here today, our board members, including several who are not able to be with us today. We also have a great group of interns and research fellows who are helping out, and I think will help make today a big success. If you're not familiar with us, Oklahoma Policy Institute is a state policy organization that believes that Oklahoma can be a great state, one that ensures prosperity for all of our citizens through good schools, good jobs, good health, and strong communities. To make the best possible policy decisions, policymakers and citizens need good, factual, credible information. Our role is to provide the facts and advocate for fair and responsible public policies through analysis and impact. So it is really exciting to see such a large crowd here today. And I'm not 100% sure of what accounts for this high level of interest, but I have a few theories I want to share. One is that there's been some controversy of late about whether my job is in jeopardy. So I do want to assure you that's not me. My job is safe, although there may be some in the legislature who maybe suggest that should be open for debate. So another possibility is that a lot of you showed up hearing that OPI is going to be putting on a conference and that there's going to be some great swag available. Well, if that's why you're here, I'm sorry to say, we're not that OPI. However, we do have some great merchandise available at the back. So if you want a OK Policy bumper sticker, coffee cup, hoodie, and so on, then please find time during one of the breaks or on your way out to make a purchase. Another theory was that you've heard that our keynote speaker is a very cool woman named Annie. Well, not her. Again, sorry to disappoint you. However, you will be hearing from Annie McKay, and you'll be very glad that you will be. So I'm just wondering, is there any way to get a little bit more light on stage? I've got notes, and I'm really having a hard time being able to read the notes. Well, that just leaves one reason to explain why all of you are here, and unfortunately, this is it. So, this is the first aerial picture of Oklahoma's state budget. Now, if there was any doubt that I will depress the hell out of you for the next 30 minutes, you can be assured that I will, but I also hope that I will be able to at least end with some reasons for hope and some solutions. Nope, I think that's not necessarily going to make it better. All right, so how we get out of this hole? Sure, Anne-Claire Duncan, to the rescue, thank you, okay. So, before we get into the numbers, I always like to start with a reminder of what our budget is really about. Our budget is a reflection of our values. So I think this is a really meaningful quote from Senator Hubert Humphrey. The moral test of government is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the aged, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. And as we're going through the numbers, I think it's worth asking, how are we doing in meeting this moral test of government? The vision that we have of a strong, prosperous Oklahoma is not a partisan or ideological one. There are shared goals that all Oklahomans aspire to. If we believe in strong families, in economic opportunity, financial security, in protecting our natural resources, in good health and safe communities, then an adequately funded public sector is indispensable. This isn't to say that government alone is going to allow us to meet any of our goals, but we need government as a strong and effective partner alongside the private sector, nonprofits, foundations, churches, and families. A lot of things. So let's start very briefly with the economy. And as I've been updating the slide every week, it just gets worse and worse, although apparently this week is a little better. But as you may have heard, energy prices are having a bit of a rough time. And as much as we've diversified, when energy plummets, then it's going to create economic issues for the state. Oops, back one. Okay. So if you didn't see it, energy prices are low. If you look at our unemployment rate, we are seeing that low energy prices are having some impact on broad economic indicators. Our unemployment rate is up some, but not as much as many would have expected. So in November, our unemployment rate was 4.2%. That is slightly up from where we were a year ago, but we are still below the national average. If you look at the nation as a whole, is about 5%. Even though our unemployment rate is low, there are a great number of Oklahomans who are struggling. 1 in 6 have family incomes below the poverty level, and 1 in 6 count on government benefits to put food on the table every month. We saw a huge leap in the number of Oklahomans receiving food assistance during the Great Recession, and those numbers never really receded. We did see a decline in 2015, but already they're back up to above historically high levels. Okay, now to the budget. So this graph shows year-to-date general revenue collections through December. We're halfway through the current fiscal year. Compared to last year, general revenue collections are down 6%. But what is also really significant is that we are still about 15% below pre-recession levels for the first half of the year. We never managed to climb all the way back to where we were before we started to see revenues go. Before the recession, we saw a couple years of growth, then general revenues went flat, and then in the last year or two, they began to fall. Okay, sorry. So this chart shows why we're facing mid-year budget cuts. The legislature appropriated the budget this year based on last year's revenue projections, and there was a 5% cushion built into the budget. The projections are now for revenues to be about 7.7%, the certified estimate. If you look, the blue lines show what was initially expected. The red lines is what was the revised projections that the Board of Equalization certified in December. For the year, the projected shortfall based on last month's numbers were about $156 million. That is why the Office of Management and Enterprise Services announced mid-year budget cuts or a revenue failure beginning in January. That revenue failure led to cuts of 3% across the board to agencies' allocations from the General Revenue Fund. So here you can see how much of a cut various agencies took. Common Education took the largest cut, $47 million, and the strong expectation are that they're going to see an additional cut because of shortfalls in the 1017 fund, which funds part of education's budget. So they're looking about an additional $19 million. If projections continue to go downhill, we may be facing a second revenue failure announced in the midst of this year. So that $177 million in mid-year cuts could get worse. So that's what we're facing this year. This is what we're looking ahead to next year. And you've all now heard that $900 million number. $900 million is how much less money is projected to be available for next year's budget than what was available this year. There's two major components to the shortfall. One is the continued fall in energy prices and accompanying slowdown in economic activity. The other is that we built a large hole into next year's budget by using several $100 million of one-time revenues to get last year's budget to balance. So I'm not sure if you can see it, but there's almost $300 million in special cash that was used in this year's budget. Very little of that is going to be available for next year. So we're looking at a $900 million shortfall, and all expectations are that when the Board of Equalization gets together to meet again in a few weeks, that hole is going to grow to $1.1 billion, 1.2, 1.4. Really, nobody knows how much worse it's going to get, but nobody expects it's going to get any better when they recertify. So this chart looks at where state appropriations go to. And what you have to realize is that 90% of all appropriated dollars go to core services in just 10 agencies, all in the areas of education, health, human services, public safety, and transportation. All the other agencies of state government, which includes the 3 branches of government, which includes the tax commission and the health department and the state auditor's office and veteran care facilities, all those other 60+ agencies together make up around 10% and about $700 million. So when you're dealing with a $900 million shortfall or any shortfall of significant amounts, you can't get there without impacting the budgets of those 10 dozen core agencies in those areas. Back one. That is a very sensitive clicker. Okay, so if you look at overall state appropriations, the total appropriated budget now stands at a little less than $7 billion. This includes the mid-year cuts that were implemented earlier this month. That's some $80 million less than 8 years ago. And that doesn't take into account inflation, population growth, higher school enrollment, growing caseloads, declining federal match, and other factors which push up the cost of providing services. So if you adjust for inflation, this year's initial budget is about $900 million, or 11.4% below where we were in 2009. So since at least the Great Recession, we haven't been keeping up. So let's take a look at what a budget that's 11% smaller than 2009 means in practice. I'll be discussing the impact of state services in broad strokes, but this afternoon we'll be hearing from folks on the front lines of budget cuts in various areas that I'll be talking about. Once again, back one. So many of you will have seen these numbers over the years based on a report that the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities puts out that looks at the change in state support for school aid funding in all 50 states. And Oklahoma has cut its support for the school aid formula by more than any state in the nation. We are down about 24% compared to where we were in 2009, and that was before the mid-year cut, which took another $24 million out of the formula this past month. Now, that's not the only measure of school funding, and some have contested these numbers. So, that is really... So this year, the Center on Budget provided a couple of other measures. If you look at total state funding, Oklahoma's cut education funding by 15%, adjusted for inflation. That's the 6th deepest cut in the nation. If you look at total state and local funding, K-12 funding has been cut about 10% per pupil since 2008, adjusted for inflation. And by that measure, our cuts are 10th worst in the nation. Since 2008, state aid funding has decreased by just under $200 million, which includes this year's mid-year budget cut. During this same period of time, total K-12 enrollment has grown by over 50,000 students. So more students in the classroom, substantially less state support. So we are facing a real crisis in the area of teacher recruitment and retention. Oklahoma's teachers are third lowest paid in the nation. This chart shows all 50 states, and there we are, third from the bottom. Those numbers include healthcare and retirement benefits. So our average teacher compensation is around $44,000. We are 49th in per pupil funding overall, but also 49th in per pupil expenditures on instruction and salaries. We've issued nearly 1,000 emergency certifications this year. 4 years ago, that number was around 30. So to cite one school superintendent, David Pennington of Ponca City, who is trying to recruit special education teachers, he says, "This crisis has been coming for a long time. Forget about replacing them with someone of the same quality. I'm just worried about replacing them, period." And this has a real impact on students. We're seeing a significant decline in average teacher experience and a significant decline, particularly in experience in schools with the highest number of low and moderate income students. And we know that when students are taught by less experienced teachers, they do more poorly. So this retention and recruitment issue is really having an impact on our schools. So some of you will have seen this before. Superintendent Hoffmeister shared this JPEG, which said that if you are a mid-level associate at Chipotle's, you can make more money than the most qualified, experienced Oklahoma teachers. Now, when the legislature learned about this, they expressed outrage and promised to take bold action to drive down wages in the fast casual sector. So we've heard a lot about the cuts to K-12 education, and I think that folks in the public education community have been very strong and vocal advocates. You have the OklaEd hashtag, you have organizations like the PLAC and the Sand Springs PAAT and the OEA and COSA and Stand for Children. And I think people are aware of what's going on in public schools, but it's not just public schools. So higher education, going into this year, higher ed was already down $76 million, and they just took another $24 million cut. Higher ed has tried to limit tuition increases, but over the past 6 years, students have seen an average annual increase of 5%. The share of higher ed funding from state appropriations was 50% as recently as 2007. It's now just 34% in 2015. If you look at healthcare, we've already cut nearly $500 million from the Medicaid program since 2010. Every time we need to cut one state dollar from the Medicaid program, we need to make $2.50 to about $3 in total cuts because of the loss of federal matching funds. This might be the most heartbreaking consequence of our failure to meet vital state services, and that is we have over 7,000 Oklahomans with developmental disabilities who are waiting to receive home and community-based waiver services. We'll be hearing from one of the providers and one of the parents this afternoon. But some families have been on the waiting list for over 9 years. We can also talk about the waiting list for those with mental illness and drug addiction. We have one of the highest rates of mental illness in the nation, yet 60% of adults with mental illness are not getting the treatment they need. And if you didn't see it earlier this week, hope you'll find the tremendous article that Jacqueline Cosgrove of the Oklahoman did on the history of mental health services in Oklahoma. Unfortunately, much of this is not new. This shows staffing and inmate capacity populations in our prison. We can have a vigorous debate about whether we lock too many people up in Oklahoma. And one of the most encouraging signs in the state is that we are having that debate, and we're seeing real signs of progress. But what it's much harder to defend is locking people up and then not spending enough to see they're being properly supervised. We have the highest inmate to officer staffing ratio in the nation. Our corrections officers are desperately overworked and underpaid, which puts their safety and that of the inmates and our communities in danger. And the mystery is how we haven't ended up on the losing end of a federal lawsuit. The entire state workforce, these numbers exclude Common Ed and Higher Ed, remains 8% smaller than it was in 2009 and smaller than it was even in 2001. Now, in some areas, productivity growth and efficiencies allow fewer people to get the work done, and that's a good thing. But when your population grows every year, over time, that means more restaurants and nursing homes to inspect, more legal disputes to resolve, more business permits to issue. At some point, a shrinking workforce simply can't keep up. So this is where we are, and how do we get here? So without question, energy prices are part of the explanation. So if you look at how much gross production tax is coming in to the General Revenue Fund, we were at about $400 million in fiscal year 2013. By next year, we're only anticipating $65 million in gross production tax from oil and gas going to the General Revenue Fund. So that is definitely part of the story. But it's only part of the story, and don't let legislators tell you that it's the whole story. So what else is going on? Well, one part of it has to do with off-the-top appropriations. And we go back. Part of it is off-the-top appropriation, and that's going to be part of the discussion among the state leaders coming up. But in broad terms, a diminishing share of our total tax dollars are going to the General Revenue Fund to be appropriated at the discretion of our legislators. So we were at about a majority, 55% of tax dollars went to the General Revenue Fund in 2007, and now we're about 45%. The largest growth in off-the-top appropriations goes to the Rhodes Fund for road and bridge maintenance and repair. That was $475 million this year, and there is an automatic scheduled increase of another $60 million in 2017. The Rhodes Fund is supposed to top off at around $590 million in 2018. That's the largest growth, but there's over $2 billion in off-the-top revenues, and it goes to a wide range of funds across state government. Another major factor, which some of you may have heard us say a thing or two about over the last several years, are tax cuts. Our top income tax rate was 6.65% in 2014. Today, it is 5%, and there is another cut in the top income tax rate that is scheduled to take effect in 2018 if a very weak trigger mechanism is met. That is over $1 billion in revenue that has been given up because of those income tax cuts. Most of those tax cuts are going to the most affluent households in Oklahoma. The most recent tax cut, the 2016 tax cut that took the top rate down from 5.25 to 5%, that is $29 a year to the median household. And 40% of those, the ones who probably could use another $29 or $50 or $100, they're going to get nothing because none of their income is in the top bracket. So if you're wondering what you'll get, you can go to our website and calculate your tax cut. And if you think that the money might be better used to advocate for responsible budget and tax policies, we'd be happy to accept a donation. But here's what an additional $1 billion could have provided. It could have been over $350 million in additional money for Common Ed. It could have been $140 million for Higher Ed and for Medicaid.
$100 million for human services, and so on. We just put out a paper called The Cost of Tax Cuts, and you should have a one-page summary of it in your packets. So we're not saying that without tax cuts, we wouldn't now be facing a shortfall. Without question, when oil and gas prices tumble, we're always going to be facing shortfalls in Oklahoma. But without the tax cuts of the past dozen years, we would be approaching the latest economic downturn from a far stronger starting point. We could have used those revenues to pay our teachers more competitive salaries, to ensure the prisons are properly staffed, to limit college tuition increases and provide critically needed services for those with mental illness and developmental disabilities. In all likelihood, we would not already have cut per pupil state aid to schools more than any other state in the nation. And with larger budget surpluses during years of economic growth, we might also have saved more money in reserves to help us through our current economic challenges. So one more slide on this. The question is often asked, why has the lottery not solved the education funding issue? So hopefully this provides the answer. If you look at the money that is provided by the lottery and by tribal gaming compacts this year, that's about $190 million. If you look at how much money has been lost to common education, if you take Common Ed's share of that $1 billion, that's about $360 million, almost $2 for every additional dollar we get from the lottery and gaming. The lottery grows state revenues by feet, while lawmakers have been pruning off yards by cutting the income tax. And then along with tax cuts, tax breaks have taken a big toll. A big part of the explanation for why, even when times were good and our oil wells were pumping out record profits, we still couldn't find the money to take care of our core services is right here. Oklahoma Watch put out numbers a year ago where they calculated that the cost of major business tax breaks doubled from 2010 to 2014. And most of the increase was due to the escalating cost of the tax break for horizontal drilling. Even with oil prices low, the cost of tax breaks for oil and gas companies remain large. Next year, the projections are we're going to give up $160 million in gross production tax revenues in the form of rebates for economically at-risk wells. And there is at least one bill that Senator Mazie has authored that would put a moratorium on that tax rebate. And then we also have to take note about how, if we're looking at how we've ended up with chronic budget shortfalls, we have to mention the constitutional straitjacket that binds us. So with State Question 640 that passed in the early 1990s, you need a three-quarter vote of both legislative chambers or a vote of the people at the time of the next general election. So we've only had one tax increase that has been approved by the legislature and sent to the voters for approval, and that was the tobacco tax increase in 2004. So what we are seeing now is a chronic budget deficit where our tax collections no longer keep pace with the growing economy. If you look at that blue line, 15 years ago, our tax collections regularly equaled about 7 to 7.5% of state personal income. Now we're at about 5.5%, and that is continuing to fall even lower. This is data put together by Professor Kent Olson of OSU, who's with us today. We have a large and growing structural deficit, regardless of economic circumstances. In 2015, the deficit was running at about 10%, or around $700 million. Without a change in policies, that's going to grow to about $2 billion by 2030. So, what can be done? How do we get out of this mess? The good news is that there are solutions, but we can't just double down on budget cuts without inflicting devastating harm to critical services. And we can't just count on one-time revenues without making the structural deficit deeper. We need to put recurring revenues on the table. Oops, once again. So we need to remember it's the policy choices that our legislators have made over the years that have helped get us into this mess, and there are policy options available that can help get us out. So here are 6 options that are feasible, responsible, and that would help improve our fiscal situation both immediately and over the longer haul. This is not an exhaustive list or even the ideal list, but these are the ones that OK Policy is going to focus on over the coming months. And in your package, there's a one-pager which can also be downloaded from our website, which talk about the first 5 of these options. So the first thing we should do is repeal the most recent tax cuts. The tax cuts were never supposed to kick in if 2016 revenues were falling. We were only supposed to have a tax cut if 2016 revenues were higher than 2014. Well, now 2016 revenues are projected to be $640 million lower than what they were 2 years ago. But the way the bill was written, that trigger still took effect. Now, Senator Mazie is going to make the argument that the Board of Equalization was wrong to have decided that the tax cut would take effect and to try to reverse that decision. It's going to be a tough argument. But how do legislators not say, you know, we put a trigger mechanism which is supposed to be responsible, oops, our bad, let's fix this, and hold off for a while. And the fact is, our next tax cut could kick in, taking the top rate down from 5 to 4.85%, even if revenues recover only slightly. So if you look at that $5.3 billion number, which will probably end up being a little less, let's say it's $5.2 billion. If in December we project the 2018 numbers will go back up to 5.5 billion, then that next tax cut will kick in again, even if we're hundreds of millions of dollars, over $1 billion below what we were before this latest downturn. So we need to halt and reverse those tax cuts. Next thing we can do is adopt combined corporate reporting. A majority of states that have a corporate income tax, those are the states in blue, have already adopted combined corporate reporting. Not going to go into all the specifics of this, but this is a way that states can close a common loophole that corporations use to shift their income from states like Oklahoma to subsidiary companies in other states that don't have the corporate income tax. So we need to adopt combined corporate reporting. Another thing we can do is limit itemized income tax deductions. And in particular, we need to do away with the double deduction for state income tax payments. Oklahoma is one of the few states where if you itemize your deductions on your federal income tax and you claim a deduction for your state income tax, that you can then carry that over onto your state income tax. So you end up deducting your state income tax from your state income tax. Is that making any sense to anybody else? Because it's really not making sense to me. It is an unnecessary, inefficient tax break that provides no public policy purpose, and we should get rid of it. Another thing we should do is enhance collection of taxes that are owed on online sales. We're going to have, I hope, more of a discussion about that during the next panel. This is something that is of particular interest to cities. There are various things that we should be considering regarding the sales tax, but a number of states have passed what's called Amazon laws that allow states like Oklahoma to collect sales from a number of companies that are online based, that don't have a plant or stores directly in states like Oklahoma. So we need to do more to enhance collection of online sales. And then the final thing I want to talk about is that we need to accept federal funds to expand health insurance. not only would we be providing health care to at least 100,000 Oklahomans who don't have it, not only would we be helping our rural hospitals and financially strapped community health centers and other healthcare providers, not only would we be helping businesses whose workers would be more productive if they had health care, not only would we be removing some of the strains on our mental health system, we would save the state money by bringing in those federal dollars, by covering services that the state currently provides with 100% state funds, and shifting that over to Medicaid or Insure Oklahoma or some other mechanism. We would have a net benefit to the state. So the Levitt report that was done several years ago calculated that the net benefit to the state from additional tax revenues, from a higher federal Medicaid match rate, would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $450 million over 10 years. That's not a one-year figure, that's a 10-year figure, but that would help substantially right now as we're looking at deficits and as we're looking at the possibility of further cuts to our health insurance, healthcare programs. So those are the recurring revenue options that we should look at. We're also going to have to look at one-time revenue options. The Rainy Day Fund currently has about $385 million in it. All of that money could be made available this year. 3/8 could be used to help make up some part of the shortfall in this year's revenue due to the revenue failure. 3/8 could be available to make up part of the shortfall for next year, and then 1/4 could be used, or 1/4 could be used upon declaration of an emergency. They'll certainly use some rainy day money. There's going to be some concern about using all of it because the 2018 budget outlook doesn't look a whole lot better. There's lots of other one-time revenue options that'll be discussed. We could put a moratorium on tax credits and not be granting those at least over the next couple of years. We may need to defer increases to the Rhodes Fund, not go ahead with that $60 million automatic increase. We could do increased bonding and shift some money towards bonds that is currently coming out of revenue collections. We've tapped the unclaimed property fund in previous years and will no doubt do that again. And there can be careful use of agency revolving funds. We're going to talk a little bit about that during the next session with Auditor Jones. That has been used in past years and no doubt will be on the table again. The other thing that we need to do is use the current budget crisis to do better at budgeting, budget forecasting and long-term planning. I hate the use of the word opportunity when we talk about our current situation, because in reality it sounds like we have the opportunity to have a hole drilled in our head. But we do now have the chance to look at how we develop our budgets and try to put in place some more long-term planning and foresight into the process. And there were filed for this legislative session at least a half dozen bills that would try to ensure more multi-year revenue forecasts, a current services budget, and some other good promising ideas that I think would at least help us think a little further ahead when we make decisions about our tax system and about expenditures. There we go. So the last thing I want to end by encouraging all of you to be involved. We're going to say more about this afternoon about what you can do, but I really hope that you'll connect with our Together Oklahoma coalition. We have Together Oklahoma chapters now emerging in Oklahoma City, and Tulsa and others are in the works, and Kara Joy McKee will be running the afternoon session. And you need to reach out to your legislators. You need to be telling them about what the impact has been of budget cuts so far and what the implications will be if we cut further. The odds of our elected officials doing the right thing are zero unless you tell them what needs to be done. There we go. So with that, I will conclude, and I don't know if we have a little bit of time before the 10 o'clock session. We have 8 minutes, thank you. And Cloris also, as well as being my emergency light, she's also the timekeeper. So maybe 2 or 3 questions. Tyler, is there a microphone? Or Shiloh? Okay. Have one over there.
Yes, I noticed on one of your slides you were talking about modernizing sales tax. But what about modernizing other taxes such as ad valorem and property?
Yep.
I'm a city manager. We are the only state in the union that operates on sales tax only. We don't get ad valorem. We're having trouble making ends meet sometimes. And so I want to make sure that cities don't get left out of the equation. We don't get left out of the conversation. And I'm all in favor of the Amazon law, as you call it, or e-fairness.
Sure.
We've got to look at that as a state. We have lost so much of our sales tax to these internet-based companies that we really need your help.
Okay.
So we hope that you'll keep considering us in your policy debate.
Thank you. So the question was relating to, the situation for cities. Do we look at the possibility of ad valorem taxes for cities? That is certainly something that has been discussed, and without question, cities face an especially tough budget crunch given limited tax options. Mayor Rosenthal will be on the next panel, and she'll speak to that. It's often been said that Oklahomans hate all taxes, but they hate the property tax the most. That would be a especially hard sell to get through the legislature to give cities that option, but I know that there has been some discussion about it. I think that if we're going to have everything on the table, that is something that should be on the table. There's a little talk here and there about maybe higher property tax rates, not for residential property, but for commercial property. Some states have higher commercial property rates than residential. That may be something that would be palatable to voters. But cities really are painted into a corner in terms of what their revenue base is. Next question. Whoever has the mic is going to have to decide who to go to. Tyler.
Got a lot of power. I'll go all the way over to the side. David, good morning. I wanted to see, you said everything's on the table, and one thing that I used to amuse myself was to ask for a balance sheet for the state of Oklahoma, and of course we don't have a balance sheet. So what we find, though, is that we've got hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, of unproductive assets. I name a few. No offense to those who love GRDA, but there's no reason for the state of Oklahoma to own a massive power company. We own an insurance company. There's no reason for that. We own lots of real estate. No one can take advantage of that depreciation and value. And so when you look at that, there's an opportunity at some point to convert those into endowments, at least. I wouldn't advocate selling them and spending the money, but there's huge unproductive assets that the state owns that could be sold and put in endowments for particular or general benefits. And I'm curious whether or not you all have explored that and if that is also on the table. Thank you, Governor, for the contribution and suggestions. We really haven't looked much at that. And I think that there will likely be some discussions about that, and I hope that you'll continue to make your position known and make the case for what we could be doing better in terms of what the state owns and might perhaps go a different route with endowments. Another couple questions? Yeah.
Is there any appreciable upside to the consolidation of school districts that we're starting to hear about?
The consolidation of school districts. Thank you for asking the question, because that certainly has been talked about a lot. And, I think that is a genuine discussion that should be on the table. We should be having that discussion. But I think here's the thing we need to understand about school consolidation, that Oklahoma is at about the national average if you look at what we spend per student on district administration. And it's about $250 per student. If Oklahoma was able to lower what we spent on district administration to the lowest level in the nation, which is Hawaii, which has one school district, and they spend something like $35, $40 per student on consolidation. If we could get down to Hawaii's level, which is, I think, pretty unrealistic, took all the money that we're currently spending on our district level administration by lowering ourselves to Hawaii's level, and took that money and put it into instruction, that would take us from 49th in per pupil expenditures on instruction all the way to 49th. It wouldn't move the needle at all. So let's have that conversation, but let's not go into it imagining that we are going to make major advances in what we're able to pay teachers through school consolidation. There is just not enough money there to make a major dent in what we're able to pay our teachers through consolidation. Thank you for that question. Maybe one or two more questions.
Okay, I have 2 questions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on State Question 779? And also, would you agree that if education doesn't receive funding, then everyone loses eventually?
So 779 is the initiative petition that is being promoted by President Boren at University of Oklahoma. I think it is critical that we recognize the severity of the funding crisis for education. Something has to be done, and I applaud the honesty of saying that if we're going to address funding in our schools, that we need more revenue. We're not going to be able to get there just by shifting money around. So putting a revenue option on the table, saying that if we're going to address the crisis in recruitment and retention, we're going to need substantial new money, is a really healthy step. It is not the revenue proposal that we would have come up with. I think we've been pretty clear about that. But the thing is, the legislature over many years has failed to address this issue. Some people object to 779 because it's going to let the legislature off the hook if it passes. I understand that argument too, but the legislature has shown itself unwilling and unable to address this crisis, and I don't know that there's any alternative at this point, but to take it to the people and let the people decide. I think it was the right decision of the court to say, let's move forward and let the people decide about whether this is the right way to solve the crisis. All right, so we have a great panel coming up. If the panelists could make their way up to the front, I will turn this over to our legislative liaison, Demario Solomon-Simmons, who will moderate our panel on managing the state budget crisis, what should be on the table. Thank you very much.